Hello and welcome to our session Localizing Climate Security, Climate Aid and Peace in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Dr. Siad Darwish. I'm a research associate at the University of Melbourne and I run a climate security consultancy called Wayfair Consulting. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the speakers, good friends. I'm sorry I'm not with you today. My son is ill, so he needs looking after. Basically, I want to start with why do we want to talk about climate security in the Pacific? What is, what is the concern here? Climate security is increasingly being described as a threat multiplier, meaning that climate change feeds into existing conflict drivers and may enhance them. And this is food security issues, governance issues, mobility, and other issues of social cohesion. But in the Pacific in particular, the Boe Declaration on Regional Security, a landmark political agreement adopted by the Pacific Islands Forum in 2018, actually said that recognized climate change, and I quote, as the single greatest threat to livelihood, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. So internally, leaders agreed that climate change is an immense security threat. Quite early on, so in 2018, where lots of other places and countries have now recognized climate security as a major concern of security, including Australia. The Pacific Islands Forum did so quite earlier and elevated climate change sort of to the levels or even above of those of traditional military threats. So climate security thereby is an important and powerful, but also very contested frame. And as some of the great Pacific scholars like ANU's own George Carter, for example, have written, is that if defined too narrowly, climate security can securitize aid and reproduce colonial logics, securitize all these issues related to climate security. But defined inclusively and broadly, and in the Pacific also in a sort of relational way that accepts spiritual security and other forms of security, it can help us understand everyday safety and inequality and resilience from a gendered, local, and even indigenous perspectives. So a broader understanding of climate security actually can be quite illuminating. Climate security also from that perspective, once we have a broader understanding, it allows us to look at very many different intersecting issues like food security, economic shocks, gendered burdens of care, forced migration, and so on, land disputes, criminal networks. And all of that, of course, happens in the Indo-Pacific within shifting geopolitical landscapes. So really talking about sort of a competition that's happening that's also linked to climate change and energy security across the Pacific. So what we then want to highlight in this panel is we want to ground this idea of climate security, really sort of what does it mean practically in different areas, rooted in justice, equality, and local agency. So what might be the use of climate security from an aid and development perspective? We've got some really fantastic speakers today with us. I will introduce them one by one. Sadly, one of our speakers and a good friend, Paulo, has dropped out last minute. He's actually had to go to hospital, and we wish him well and hope that he is very well. He's actually worked on climate peace and security in the Pacific for more than 15 years and has done fascinating work. So I hope we can reconnect with him, and we wish him very well. But we should start with Anouk Wright. Dr. Anouk Wright is a sociologist with an interest in peace and conflict in the Pacific Islands region. She was based in the Solomon Islands for 2 decades doing policy-oriented research and has managed over 20 projects with Pacific governments, media, policy, and correctional services. Dr. Anouk Wright also done really interesting work on the role of indigenous knowledge in environmental peace building across the Pacific. And she's an associate professor with the Department of Pacific Affairs at ANU and an adjunct senior fellow with the Solomon Islands National University. Thank you, Anouk, and over to you, please.
Thank you, Sid, and great to see you even virtually this morning. I think I'll start by thanking a few people for bringing us together. I'm always actually amazed at my colleagues at the Development Policy Centre. You know, it's December and most of us are winding down, and somehow they manage to put on this amazing conference each year, which really is a valuable opportunity for all of us to learn from each other as practitioners, researchers, and also donors and funders. So just a thanks to the organisers for, you know, all the hard work that's actually brought us here today. Thanks also to Siad and Christine for bringing us together in this interesting panel at a timely sort of point as we think about climate security. So as Siad has outlined, I'm based here at the Department of Pacific Affairs, which is up the road at ANU. And I've been working in peace and conflict studies for a long time and how it intersects with development as well. These days, much of my development-related work is project design and review, rather than doing in-the-field research, but I have been involved with several teams doing that as well. So what I thought I'd talk about today is, first of all, the concept of climate security and some of my reservations about the concept and how we can think about the concept in useful ways. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about community-based environmental management and how I think that can be a route to addressing some of the climate change impacts that are coming. So climate security, why is it so popular, and why are we here talking about it today? I think we can see that, you know, climate security relates to the securitization of everything that I often talk about, which reflects the cycles of war and militarization that the region and more broadly the world is in today. Now, the concept of climate security, as Siad has mentioned in his introduction, is used by a wide range of Pacific actors. And really, that is to call attention to the fact that climate change is an existential threat to the Pacific Islands, and also to have some practical applications of this. So one of the practical applications that came out recently was a Pacific Climate Security Assessment Guide, published by the Forum and others. And it sort of looks at climate security, how we would understand it. And it has three practical elements to it. The first one was to improve climate security knowledge, capacities, communication, and programming. The second thing, to mainstream climate security across policies. And the third thing is to avoid maladaptation and mitigation through climate conflict and culturally sensitive approaches. And it's really that third practice that I'll be talking a bit more about today. So climate security, while we can see it's being instrumentalized and it's being used as a term around the Pacific, I also have several reservations, I guess, about how we adopt and use this concept. So climate security has a certain boundary around it, and I think we just need to be aware of this boundary and engage with it more critically. Because when we talk about security, we talk about protection from threats of violence, particularly physical violence. And we generally focus on state actors and so-called security partners, you know, police, defense forces, and the like. Now, what's the difference between peace and security? Well, peace actually talks about tackling the causes of violence. So when we had that initial definition from Galtung, which is still useful today, he talked about negative peace, the absence of violent wars, and also about positive peace as actually addressing the causes of structural violence, the conditions of social injustice, to actually create peace over the longer term. So when we call threats from climate change and responses to climate change issues as climate security, what are we actually losing? Okay, the first thing we're losing is that it does divert attention away from the fact that a major driver of climate change is consumption of minerals and production of emissions. So security actors are a major, major part of the climate change crisis. So global spending on the military actually jumped by 10% just in 2024 alone. This is the largest increase since World War II, and it's amounting to $334 USD per capita in the world. So massive, unquantified amounts of minerals are actually being used by our security sector. Okay, to put this in further context, so 0.14 of military spending by the US in 2023 actually amounted to all of the climate change-related ODF in the Pacific Islands region across all donors, 0.14%. So next time you hear the word climate security, I want you to think about this in a broader concept. Who is responsible for the climate change crisis? How are security actors actually involved? And what we can do about it. I do think that climate security has the danger of avoiding responsibility for the threat. And climate change also de-identifies, I guess, threats that are posed on the Pacific Islands region. Now, the second problem with the climate security frame, as far as it is applied in our region, is that it's very much on immediate threats. What are climate security threats? Well, sea level rise, all of these things. And not necessarily where these threats came from. So one of the pieces of work, which I think I put on the slide, that I've been working on for several years with colleagues in the Solomon Islands, is on environmental peace building. And we look at how the ability to respond to climate change threats in the islands is created by ruptures. And these ruptures are caused by colonialism, by extractive industries, by imposition of the Western liberal state without much thought to the local context, and also by the lack of connection between science and Indigenous priorities. So the paper that's on the board we've co-written with Professor Gegeo and others, and it goes into a little bit more about why we're in this crisis we're in, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that as well. Now, climate change too is a threat that must be accommodated and adapted to in a very different way from standard security threats. And it must be looked at differently by security actors. So 80% of islanders, Pacific Islanders across the region, live within 5 kilometers of the coast. So climate change, it's a sea level rise problem, but it's also a problem of the productivity of both the land and the sea resources that they rely on to feed themselves. And this also is not just a problem of food security, but it's also a problem of actually social cohesion, identity of Pacific peoples, who are known for their ability to survive for thousands of years off their land and sea interactions. And this is a critical part of food, culture, arts, and other parts of Pacific life. So I'm just checking how I'm going for time. Yeah, okay, so I have many anecdotes of this, but I'll leave them aside maybe for the question and answer point of our session this morning. But basically responding to these threats is going to require a very different response than our standard development and security responses. And it's going to have to include Indigenous knowledge, localized knowledge about the environment, married with science and technologies. The interaction of these threats is also quite complex. So even when we look at climate change, divorced from other environmental threats, we do ourselves a disservice. So we have in Solomon Islands, for example, and I'll use the island of Isabel as an example, we have a shrinking islands problem. Basically, Isabel is the longest island in the Solomon Islands. It has, but 10% of the land currently is under mining license. So we have it shrinking a little bit because of extractive industries. We have it shrinking significantly because of climate change. And some of the threats that have been exacerbated, for example, through cutting of mangroves and other environmental uses. Now, so we have already our land and being shrunk by extractive industries, being shrunk by climate change, and the impact on the sea resources is significant. So runoffs from logging and mining to the sea will also eventually impact the food supply to Honiara, because Isabel Island is one of the major sources of fish to Honiara's markets, food markets. Now, Isabel also has a culture that's matrilineal, and the agency and role of women is being eroded as well through these threats involved from global industry as well as climate change. So we have a very complex, wicked problem for environmental management and development actors. The island is shrinking due to global forces, extractive industries, climate change, and many of these global forces are, to a degree, beyond the control of local actors. Now, how do you deal with these kind of problems? So far, I have not seen any innovation that can actually just match the success of Indigenous, community-led management of natural resources and food systems, rights in practice. Now, community-led management allows members of the community to decide on solutions to land and sea use activities such as balancing and limiting harvesting, monitoring changes to the coastal area, and responding to climate changes, often with indigenous means such as replanting mangroves rather than modern technologies. Because the Solomon Islands is also very culturally diverse, interactions between gender, tradition, culture, and local power dynamics can also vary. So one of the useful things that the development sector has done is to have more of a critical view at gender and social inclusion dynamics within communities, and developing ways where we can draw on Indigenous traditions to listen, understand, and get the whole community's support for this change. And just a quick plug, we have a State of the Pacific conference. It's happening in April next year at ANU, and we will be talking a bit more about gender and change, particularly some ways that Pacific cultures can support both inclusivity and sustainability. So we can talk more about that in April as well. But we need to look at gender and social inclusion and sustainable management as not abstract concepts, but things in practice, and look at where it's been practiced and how we can increase this practice. So Pacific conservation traditions, there are many of them, but one key one that sort of unites many of the islands is to have areas of the sea, for example, that are taboo or closed to fishing. These small practices can actually see returns of species that have been overfished within 2 years in some cases, and if they are accompanied by an enabling environment that actually manages other threats, particularly pollution and overfishing more broadly in the offshore fisheries, then these can lead to real improvements in food security. So when we talked in environmental peace building, we talk about a few ways forward to get out of the trap that we're in, at the shrinking islands problem that we're in. One is resistance to unsustainable extractive developments in particular. The second one is return to conservation traditions, but with science. So the best innovations that I've seen actually come out from places like the Solomon Islands National University and other national universities and the University of South Pacific. And we have now Pacific Islanders who are using both traditional knowledge and standard science to identify threats to their ocean, their oceanic, marine, aquatic, and terrestrial environments, and respond with ways that combine Indigenous knowledge and science in a solid way to adapt to the threats that are coming and the threats that we already have. So the focus now really should be on enabling Indigenous communities to manage their resources in the face of modern challenges and a changing climate. So some important support that is needed from the development sector is information and education, backup from authorities in law enforcement for local conservation measures and management measures, and also national governments actually limiting encroachments and unsustainable practice such as pollution, particularly in areas surrounding coastal communities. So every time I go to a development conference, there's always like a focus on innovation and sessions on innovation. And innovation is great, but we don't need another new innovation. We actually need to just synthesize the good innovations we have, those that arise from Pacific cultures and arise from science, so that we can make sure that people can feed themselves, live off the land and sea, and retain their Indigenous rights to their natural resources and also their cultural heritage. And this last part's really important. So one of the things I'm working on at the moment is a paper on how Indigenous people can win. So how Indigenous people can contest extractive industries and also manage their resources sustainably against quite significant odds. So protection from all of these will require change from the aid and development sector as well as from our national and regional institutions. What we want to move away from is that all of the difficult choices for the sustainability of the islands actually falling with communities. So in the paper that I'm talking about, we look at communities that literally have the choice of, do we use our forest for carbon credits, or do we say yes to the mining company that is lobbying us intensively to open up our land to mining? These are difficult choices, often faced alone by community members against global industries. what if the development sector was able to support people with those decisions a bit better so that we can make informed decisions and have real sustainable development across our islands. Now, climate-related aid is high, so there are opportunities there. Actually, as roughly like 1/3 of ODA to the Pacific Islands is tagged in some way as climate-related. So we've made progress in this. But over the long run, actually, if you look at the data since 2020, it's actually only about 10 to 15% of aid flows. And what we don't know is like how much of this aid that is tagged as climate is actually addressing all the threats I've talked about in a more comprehensive way. Is it actually creating peace and security through addressing climate risks? So going back to our concept of climate security, yes, climate change is very much related to security, but it shouldn't be an optional add-on to add to the aid status quo or the security status quo. We fundamentally need to think about rights, responsibility. Who is responsible for the climate crisis? Who has the rights to natural resources in the islands? And how do we address risks, responsibility, and right historical wrongs of the past? So, should we be talking about climate security? Should we be talking about climate peace and security? Or should we be talking about climate justice? Thank you.
Thank you, Anouk. That was a brilliant contribution. I really like that we started with the boundaries of climate security, and sort of that Anouk really reminds us that we cannot forget that who's responsible for the climate crisis and the role of the security apparatus in it. So she talks about the obscuring of this concept, but also what it can reveal. And this particular focus on rights and responsibilities, and that a lot of the solutions lie with indigenous practices in the region, and that there is a clear role for development actors in terms of governance support, in education, in the linking of indigenous solutions to maybe Western science. And what Anouk's talk also reminded me of in 2021, we organized a conference, Environmental Peace Building in the Asia-Pacific. And one of the key outcomes was that people in the Asia-Pacific, in the Pacific Islands in particular, experienced climate change like colonization. There was a clear loss of land, a loss of traditions associated with that, and not just a loss. I mean, there was a change. But to really anchor this in the past and in justice is incredibly important. So thank you very much, Anouk, for that contribution. And we come back to questions later on. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Ambika Vishwanath. She's the co-founder and director of the India-based Kubaland Initiative and recipient of the 2024 Maitri Fellowship funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where she's based at La Trobe University. Ambika is a geopolitical analyst and water security specialist with an interest in enhanced global climate security cooperation, and she's done fascinating work across the world, but in the Middle East, for example, on water security. At La Trobe, she explores opportunities for enhanced climate security cooperation between India and Australia with a focus on the Pacific Islands. Thank you, Ambika. It's good to see you.
I don't know if you can see us, but I'm waving at you. Yeah. Hi, sorry. I was saying thank you, Siad. And I also said I don't know if you can see us, but I was waving at you. Okay, good morning, everyone. As Siad mentioned, my name is Ambika Vishwanath. I won't go through what I'm doing and my affiliation because I think he gave a very long introduction to me. But it's great to be here. The first time I came to this conference was 3 years ago, which is also the first time I ever came to Australia. And it's great to be back. So thank you, Siad and Christine, for facilitating my return to this fantastic conference. I've been working in the space of security and foreign policy for close to 20 years right now, and added a climate lens to that for the last, I would say, 10 years or so. And I say a climate lens because I don't think I'm a climate expert at all. I've been working more in the space of water, but you can't do water without climate or climate without water. And so for me, that climate lens was a natural progression from the work that I've been doing. And for the last year and a half, I've been living in Australia, in Melbourne, at Trobe on the Maitri Fellowship, which is a fellowship that is funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to increase the bilateral engagement between India and Australia. And my work and my research has been focusing on what it is that India and Australia can do in a much more concerted, thoughtful manner in terms of their partnerships in the Pacific region. If we were to bring a more climate and security lens to the projects that either exist or can be brought forward, right? I think Anouk gave a fantastic framing of what's happening in this space when it comes to discussion. And as somebody who's worked in the larger security and foreign policy space, I would say that this is very important to understand that this framing, the way it's looked at, if I were to sit in a conference, a very securitized conference with all the suits and the boots in somewhere in, like Singapore or in Delhi or in Europe, the way they would talk about it is completely different from how we would talk about it here. And so having some sort of better enhanced understanding of what that framing means, so that then these conversations can move beyond these obstacles that we are seeing, I think is really very important. And so I want to thank Anouk for putting that importance of that framing and those boundaries in a much more clearer manner. To say that we did not coordinate, but I feel like I'm going to naturally move on from where she left off, because one of the things that I wanted to do was also put down some of the ideas of what localized climate and security action could actually look like if we were to rethink concepts of development and aid. In the last year, I have been in several different discussions, whether it's on climate, whether it's on foreign policy, whether it's on food security. Last week, I was in South Africa at the G20. The one overall point of discussion, regardless of who you're talking to, is the question of the changing nature of aid, right? And the one thing that's always in my mind is now we really need to think about how not to do aid. I come from a region, I come from India, I come from a region where the Western concepts of how aid was implemented, we are now seeing the detrimental effects of that. And in the little time that I've been here in the Pacific and some of the field work that I've done, mostly in Fiji and in the Solomon Islands, I've realized that the conversations are very similar. And some of the challenges that you're seeing here are similar to the challenges that we've seen in many parts of South Asia as well. And so there is a huge learning opportunity in that sense, and how we can sort of push back a little bit, I would say, in how do we rethink and reframe this changing nature of aid. But before I get into that, strengthening climate partnerships, right? This has been the core of my research, and I think a really important aspect of how we move forward, both in terms of framing, but also in terms of then implementation. We can talk a lot about the framing, and I think that's really important, especially in how do we understand this from a local perspective? How do we understand it from where these projects are going to be implemented, from that perspective, from the recipient's perspective, from people who should have better agency and have that agency, but don't necessarily have the ability to translate that in a wider setting, right? So those partnerships and how we think about them really need to change. And so the focus of my research was really looking at that, at those partnerships. So if we look at the trajectory of development aid, development projects, ODI, IDA, whatever you want to call it, how has that been useful? How has that been detrimental? And what can we learn both from the mistakes but also the successes in that sense? And what do we take then going forward? Anouk really rightly pointed out that the voice of who these recipients are is almost always often missing. And we've seen that time and time again in India, in South Asia. I've worked a lot in India, obviously, and then in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka, and a little bit not in country in Pakistan, because, as an Indian to go to do field work in Pakistan is really difficult. But I work a lot with actors in Pakistan, and the same questions are coming out again and again. And so how do we strengthen climate partnerships so that this is a way forward that is, I would say, more efficient, more sustainable, and more long-lasting. And so security must be localized, not securitized. I think that's really an obvious thing, but sometimes we need to restate the obvious again and again, so that when we think about it from a research perspective, from an analysis and implementation perspective, also then from a funding perspective, we're thinking about it more and more, right? Triangular cooperation, and this is really where my research and my work has been focused for the last couple of years, is on the triangular cooperation. And why do I say this is because for too long now, we have seen these development projects, aid, implementation. It's a very one-way street, right? You have had, and I mean, sure, there was a time and place for that, and the way that was implemented, aid was a tool of soft power and foreign policy and things like that. But that is changing now, and I think the nature of how we do this also should change. And so, for me, I think triangular partnerships can be a really important tool. And one of the things that I feel like is really important in this sense is looking at why triangular partnerships and then how triangular partnerships. And I have some examples as to what this means. But one of the biggest advantages of the triangular partnerships, and I mean, I use triangle right here, but we can have multilateral, minilateral partnerships, however it works, right? Is that one, there's greater accountability in many ways. Also, you can fill gaps that a lot of the big donors don't want to work on. And this is one of the things that I found the most, which I have to say I was really surprised by. Many of you in this room might not have been surprised by. But looking, when I was doing field work, when I was visiting projects and understanding what it is that Australia and some of the big donors in the Pacific have been doing, New Zealand, for example, the US, I'm leaving aside the multilateral donors, right, the UN agencies and all of that, but more country-level donors. They all tended to work on incredibly large projects, right? The big ones. And when they had systems and criteria, there was, they didn't have like a gender lens, for example, unless the project was above a certain dollar benchmark. This makes no sense to me. I'm sure it makes no sense to a lot of you here. What happens to then all the smaller projects that need to be implemented and worked on, where we can then use the local knowledge, local customs to ensure that there is more sustainability? Large projects are required for certain things, but they're not always useful and they're not always lasting, right? So when you have a triangular cooperation model where a country like India doesn't have that ability to do very large projects, but it does have the ability to do smaller projects, and it's pretty fast and it's pretty nimble, then it works because you can have a number of different things that come together. One very specific example over here is I found after research, I looked at lots of projects that happened on the water and the food security space, right? And we went through pages and pages of data of what Australia would term as a water project or a food project, and then if I were to implement the water, food, gender lens, So I looked at all of these different projects, and the one thing I realized that was missing, I mean, it was done a little bit, but really missing, was the skill building side of these things, right? So you can implement a big project, and we saw that in many parts of South Asia, that the big donors would come, they would put together a big project, they would say, water purification plant or whatever it might be, and it doesn't have to be a big plant, but they would put this together, it would be very fancy, and I saw this, the big AAC posters everywhere, and the New Zealand posters everywhere. But then what happens after you've left? What happens to running those projects? What happens to ensuring that those projects are lasting and are adapting to new forms of climate changes, weather pattern changes, heat changes? That is something that was missing in all of these. And so the skill building concept of in those projects, I thought was a really important component where both India, but then also other partners that have that ability could step in. And I am not a big fan of starting a new project at all. There's plenty of them going on. A lot of them just have a little bit of concepts and connections that are missing. And so I identified about 10 different projects, which then we presented to both the Australian government, but also to the Indian government, and then several other European governments that wanted to participate on what is known as the Australia-India Future Skills Initiative. This is an initiative that already exists. Money has been earmarked for it. Location has been earmarked for it. But it hadn't really been implemented. And so I fit the Skills Initiative project with existing large projects that needed the skill building for either a local community, maybe, women engineers, maybe the skill building of young folks who had just graduated, part of, another education program, and then come back to their country to identify them, build those skills. Because while education is important, sometimes skills are missing in those spaces. So to build those skills and match them then with these large projects. So how do we use what was already existing? And so, I have a lot of examples of what that triangular cooperation could look like, but I think that's a really important component to be able to use that local knowledge and then create cycles that are sustainable. Climate security for peace and resilience. I won't go into this too much again because Anouk touched quite a bit on this, but if we understand how these ties can actually support and learn from that knowledge and then build on that, I think those are really useful. I'll give you another example over here, and this is again work that I looked at. So the Bureau, the BOM in Australia, Bureau of Meteorology, has, never mind that we'll gloss over the fact that they had this new website which they spent a ridiculous amount of money on. I'm still questioning that. I think if they just outsourced that to India, they would have done it in like 1/3 that amount of money, and we could have used that money for something else. But I will not comment on that more. But they have some very interesting MET programs that work with Pacific Island countries. So I studied those programs. I also studied then, and I'm not a meteorologist, right? So I worked with a lot of the scientists to try to understand, but some of these basic skill research I think was quite very interesting for me to do. And then I looked at what India has, which is this AgroMet app. Right? Now, the fact that India is pretty top class in its software development and app development is not a secret, it's well known. And this AgroMet app, it's a very simple SMS-based app that has been rolled out across several districts across India, also in parts of Bangladesh in pilot right now, to inform in local languages to farmers and people who are in the ancillary agricultural sector on regular changes on weather patterns. So this is things like heat patterns, which is something that often gets missed out when we talk about weather changes, but also then monsoons shifting and the app does it in your local language. So it's really drilled down. So it's not just like local, like in India, would it be Hindi or Tamil, but the dialects down in that district as well, right? And the software is really easy. I looked at it, and it's incredibly cheap by an Australian dollar standard, right? Not incredibly cheap in India, but pretty cheap here. So I matched that to what the BOM was already trying to do, working with the Pacific Island on some of this MET weather systems, all incredibly high level and very fancy, but not really drilling down to accessibility in terms of information sharing to some of the remote islands across the Pacific region, where you can get data from that region, but also then connect to folks who might need that information in their local language. And so we put together how this app in India can be redone, the software, for perhaps some pilot programs in some of the countries over here, and then rolled out, tested, and then re-rolled out as it is required. And the per unit cost, when we made that costing, was so cheap that the folks that we spoke to in government here were like, this is too cheap. So I said, well, this is not a bad thing, right? This means you can roll it out even wider, and it has that ability to be sustainable because it is done in that local language, right? So understanding how we can then support that community-rooted learning and knowledge, I thought was really important. How am I doing on time? I have no idea. So I'll just take a couple more minutes. Can we change the slide, please? Yeah. Oh, thank you. This is some of the larger area of research that I've been working on, and this is specifically for India, Australia, and partners in the Pacific, right? Now, I looked at a lot of community-based action that could be done. I have more examples if there's of interest to anyone. But how do we then scale that up? And how do we ensure that it reaches some of those folks sitting in the security sector, and to ensure that that thinking is also changed, then the direction of how they move forward, how policies are made, how funding is then realigned, and all of that. And these are some of the initiatives that I'd identified. I mean, these are not new, these are existing initiatives, but the idea of working within existing initiatives to ensure then that there is better coordination and then better implementation going forward. So, for example, under the International Solar Alliance, we already have the International Solar Alliance is expanding in the Pacific region. And they have a very excellent learning program within the ISA on just sharing best practices, where within that group, they share also all the obstacles, the challenges, and the mistakes and the missteps, which I think is a very unique in some ways. It's not often that you have these large multilateral forums that actually do this in such a concerted manner. And it's also at the government level, but also at the civil society level. And so bringing that best practice learning tool to learn from what's happening here, both the successes and some of the failures, the missteps, the obstacles, and then taking that to other island countries, right? The Indian Ocean side of the Indo-Pacific is facing so many similar challenges. So some cross-learning over there within the ISA. And then the last one, I mean, there's lots over here, but on the gender-inclusive climate action, this for me was really important. Everything that I looked at, I applied a gender filter to it. There was very little that came up. So we need to, I feel like I need to rethink how my filters are, but also then how we do these projects. But within the ISA, gender is a very key component of what the Solar Alliance does. Also within the CDRI, there is incredible amounts of training that is being done within the CDRI on looking at implementation when it's from a reaction perspective, right? So women-only teams within humanitarian assistance disasters, for example, but not so much on the adaptation and long-term mitigation side. So how can we bring that knowledge, understanding, and then learning so that the CDRI on both sides can be better strengthened? I think I'll leave it at that for now, and happy to answer any questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ambika.
Sorry if I went way over time, Siad.
Not at all. Sorry, I can't. You can hear me. Yes, you can hear me. Sorry, I couldn't see myself. Thank you, Ambika. We actually have questions afterwards, but what Ambika did is she reminded us of something that I feel Ambika has done really well previously, is she asked the question of how not to do aid in the current context, right? And it's a very important question given the state of aid. And she then presented what seems like a very novel type of partnership, right? Not a sort of top-down West to non-Western countries, but a kind of partnership that is triangular, that goes beyond even this problematic idea of South-South cooperation, but really a triangular relationship. And I think that is a new way to explore ways forward to aid, but also just ways forward to climate action. And India, of course, being a real champion of climate justice in the world. I really like this idea. Also, what is essential about the work that she's done, and sort of what we have to think about is the gender lens in all of that. And I guess we hear more about this, but I think there's a lot to be done, and that's also what my own research has shown again and again. In a certain way, Ambika also gives an example of what Anouk said and how this sort of meeting of Western knowledge and science with local knowledge could work through this idea of the app, and how this knowledge is localized. And actually, during a recent trip to the Solomon Islands, we asked farmers if they made use of this kind of meteorological knowledge on a local level, and they said, at least the people we spoke to said they didn't. So I think there's a real opportunity for this kind of knowledge. And then, of course, and this is, I think, absolutely essential in this moment where we all soul searching in the aid industry, is this learning from our missteps and finding new ways forward. So, Ambika, thank you very much for showing us a partnership that is a new way forward. We shall move on to Christine Lindell is the Conflict and Fragility Technical Advisor at World Vision Australia, where she leads the development of technical approaches for fragile contexts, as well as the design, monitoring, and evaluation of Nexus programming. She's been working for a while at the development of a global project and the guidance on implementing regenerative farming in fragile contexts. And before joining World Vision, she worked with organizations such as the United Nations, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, and the National Democratic Institute in a range of countries. Welcome, Christine, and thank you for organizing and helping and organizing this panel.
Thanks, Siad. Let's see if my voice is going to cooperate. So yeah, as Siad mentioned, we have some very initial findings to share from a participatory climate security analysis that World Vision has been conducting and will be conducting in a couple of countries. Next slide. But first, just for context, a little bit of background on World Vision's work and I guess my work in this area. We've got a pretty long-standing practice of implementing multi-year resilience programming in highly fragile contexts, mostly in Africa, places like Somalia and South Sudan, locations of active and recurring multi-level conflict. And we have practices associated with this, a set of conflict analysis tools, IPACS, GCAR, MSTC, Alphabet Soup, which we're actually in the process of revamping right now. With our partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace. Is there feedback? Okay. To take a positive peace lens. One of the key lessons that we've gotten from this track record of programming is, particularly in working in a conflict-affected context, the critical importance of mainstreaming peace as an outcome alongside other resilience outcomes in our work as a necessity for the success of the program. These have been, as I said, sort of general resilience interventions, but particularly, there's been an accumulation of experience in climate adaptation and nature-based solutions in fragile contexts. As Siad mentioned, that's some guidance that I led a team to develop, which is specifically for World Vision's global project model on community-led natural resource management, on how to implement that in highly fragile contexts, basically collating all these lessons learned. So, overall lesson, we've learned quite a bit from this, but the key takeaway, and very much echoing themes of this panel, is the critical importance of a local approach. Locally informed, local details, deeply in tune with local actors and institutions. But as I said, the bulk of this experience has mostly been in Africa and the Middle East to date. So when earlier this year I started to hear from our field offices and our partners here in closer to home that they were starting to see and hear some indicating signs, some interesting things that could point in the direction of climate security or climate conflict concerns, I was intrigued. But I knew that if we wanted to, as an implementing organization, come to terms with an approach that we would use to tackle climate conflict, we would need a lot more information, a much deeper understanding, going beyond the climate work that we're already doing in the region, and even going beyond our usual conflict analysis tools. So hence this analysis. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. So using a new tool developed by CDA Collaborative and working with the developer of the tool, which is actually Dr. Darwish, this approach is broadly speaking centered, on a participatory approach, a participatory systems thinking approach. In concrete terms, working with several communities in different locations to with a day-long workshop to map out what they see as all of the intertwined factors of climate and conflict and how they relate to each other. as well as related vulnerabilities, doing this both together as a group as well as with separate groups of men, women, and youth, with a really strong gender lens mainstream through all of this. Again, a focus, as I've been saying, on local security perceptions, local meanings of security, to avoid, as we've been talking about, this problem of imposing a sort of top-down conception of security. A mixed methods approach, again, centered on these workshops, sort of focus group discussions, but complemented with key informant interviews, validating against some external data sets. And we're also going to go back and revalidate our findings with the communities after they're compiled. So I will say, actually, all of this is pre-validation back with communities. We can put an asterisk next to all of this. And lastly, we're an implementing organization. We're fundamentally looking for what we can do. So it's oriented towards identifying leverage points, particular points of intervention where we can come to grips and work with communities to prevent conflict. Next slide. So for the analysis locations, the first round of this analysis is focusing on Solomon Islands. We worked with a couple of communities in the Honiara area and in Malaita. The Honiara locations, just briefly, are mostly inhabited by people who have migrated from other parts of the country, whether recently or quite a long time back. Most are unemployed, working in the informal sector, doing things like reselling crops in the market. A few households operate small piggeries as well. For the Malaita locations, it's more a situation of people living on their traditional or customary lands, though there's a fair number of women who've married into the community from other locations. And most households rely on subsistence farming, some production of surplus crops, and some engagement in small-scale fishing, just as a bit of background. Next slide. Okay, so this is the heart of the analysis. As I said, the first question and the key question was essentially, what does safety and security mean to you? What does it mean to this community? So a couple of factors that were repeatedly highlighted actually across all these locations: social networks, strong linkages with family, neighbors, faith, both in the sense of faith leaders, pastors, the church as an institution, but also prayer and trust in God is something that people said contributed to their sense of safety and security. A big one, and I guess several lumped together, is everything to do with food security, water security, land and livelihoods, highly entangled there. But many people mentioned access to gardening land, basically the ability to grow enough food to feed their children, support their elders, and sell some produce at the market was kind of a key, almost mental image that people associated with safety and security. Reliable access to natural resources, communal natural resources like fishing grounds, the mangroves, as well as land ownership or ownership of a house were mentioned quite a lot. And lastly, reliable access to clean water, which is going to come up quite a bit, as well as stability of family businesses. Everyone, but women in particular, tended to highlight the importance of leadership, effective, accountive leadership, talking about usually customary leadership, which is generally male, but many women highlighted how critically important it was for this customary leadership to be someone who, one, was effective in general in enforcing the community bylaws around noise, drunkenness, etc., for sort of basic security in the community, but also a leader who was really open to and receptive to women's perspective and women's concerns in particular, sort of as their route into this critical power source. Men, in particular, tended to highlight cultural belonging as a dimension of safety and security, so things like the ability to survive on local foods, living on customary land. There was one quote of someone who defined security as born here, living here, and dying here. This strong attachment to place and land as intimately connected to security and safety. And then again, sort of more operationally, the concept of cultural traditions connected to the cultural leadership that provide pathways for mediation and justice when a dispute occurs. And lastly, most people highlighted services, including health services. Young people in particular tended to highlight services linked to opportunities or mobility, so roads, for example. But broadly speaking, this was the picture, and then of course, probably jumping out, this is very much an echoing of classic sort of human security concepts here, but with some, local flavor, some contextual factors that are critical for this location. Next slide. I'll go quickly through this. Probably because this will be familiar to most people in the audience, just sort of talking about climate stressors in the Solomon Islands. But this is, again, from communities' perspectives. It's interesting to connect to these security and conflict factors as well. So flooding, landslides, with their impact on food, water, and livelihood security. There was some interesting information about the piggeries in the Honiara location, which are alongside the river so that they have convenient access to water. But then, of course, when there is heavier rain or flooding, the piggeries are all washed away. Otherwise, landslides, coastal erosion, destroying fish breeding grounds, reducing catches. This was shared across both the Honiara and the Malaita locations, problems with flooding and, generally speaking, impact on crop production, saltwater intrusion, so on and so forth. Many people in the Malaita location, as they're finding crop production harder and harder, are contemplating a move inland to where they're seeing more opportunity. But in short, heavy impacts on food and water security, threats to livelihood, and also damage to services in the form of infrastructure, and an increasing likelihood of a need to relocate away from owned land or ancestral land. So, as I said, intersecting pretty heavily with some of those determinants of a sense of security from previously. Next slide. The really interesting stuff. So this is, again, from community's perspective, what they identified as some of the key factors or things that tend to be at the root of conflicts that they are seeing in the community. Land, surprising no one. Land is commonly cited as a major and particularly sensitive source of conflict, disputes over encroachment, new arrivals, building or expanding houses, exacerbated by population growth, but also by that climate-linked relocation that I was mentioning, hence likely to increase with these drivers. Water is another quite interesting one, again, across both sets of locations. Water scarcity being a point of increasing concern. There was discussion in the Honiara locations about tensions between households that had a water tank, a private water tank, and those that didn't, and requests to share during particularly dry periods, sometimes getting a bit pointed. Similarly, in the Malaita locations, more communal surface water points, but again, increasing stress on these water sources, risk of contamination, etc. Food stress, again, and livelihood stress, these are kind of generally acknowledged as contributing to conflict as an exacerbating factor kind of in its own right, but also as a specific driver of conflict. There were quite a few mentions in the Malaita location around garden damage from free-roaming pigs, or even recurring theft of garden crops, particularly during times of food scarcity, and that leading to inter-household conflict. And then, of course, as garden and purchased food is under stress, there's increasing strain on common pool resources, the mangroves, the fishing grounds, which then again can lead to some tension over use of these increasingly limited resources. There's also an interesting gender dimension here. The women's responsibility for water and gardening is requiring more and more labor to produce, whereas the general men's responsibility for fishing and customary land is becoming less productive and kind of giving less to do, leading to some potential household tensions. Mobility, obviously not a problem in its own right. I'm lumping a few things in under here. These are, again, draft findings. But one, of course, again, connects to land, this theme of relocation, new arrivals, host communities, tension over land ownership, etc. But also going further, some respondents in Malaita talked about youth who had relocated to Honiara for work and then come back with new norms, new behaviors that caused quite a lot of community tension and disruption, as well as multiple reports in Honiara that were linking conflict, increased extramarital affairs, and the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. Some other factors less immediately linked to climate, but raised quite a bit: intergenerational tensions, kids today, a high rate of unemployment among youth, lack of opportunities leading to petty crime, drunkenness, but also an interesting dynamic of young people, elders saying that young people are less invested in contributing to communal work, less interested in upholding the norms. Young people saying that no one's listening to them, they don't get a stake in anything, etc. Drug and alcohol use, gambling, etc., linked by everyone to unemployment. And interpersonal disrespect, this came up a lot, swearing and insults as a major deal and something that requires formal resolution through the customary system. And again, this is not linked to climate, but something to keep in mind as, this is a strain on the system and something that could be potentially an accelerant for another problem, something that could raise the seriousness level of something else quite quickly. Next slide. And then the last and most interesting bit, talking about these local capacities, these local institutions, what communities are identifying themselves, how they manage the conflict that they're seeing. One is traditional leadership. It comes up again and again by people across age and gender groups. Chiefs and elders are really respected for their ability to offer pathways for mediation. Again, the entire cultural system around this is the major infrastructure around this. But also the church and faith leaders is widely viewed as a stabilizing force, with pastors and mamas both often stepping in to resolve disputes between people or between households. Community policing and bylaws. So this is community police, volunteers working with the chief to enforce local bylaws, maintaining kind of norms in the community. And lastly, something that was mentioned a lot is collective action, social activities. So this could be anything from communal work to repair drainage systems, coming together after a disaster, or even sports events, coming together at church, etc. Participants identified while they lauded and drew attention to these systems, they also commented on a couple of shortcomings in them. There was discussion about some of the customary processes not being inclusive. In particular, many women mentioned that the traditional land resolution process is entirely conducted by men, leaving them without a voice in something that can obviously have a huge impact for them. As well as quite a few young people saying that while they think, the chief is responsible for resolving conflicts, but they felt afraid or uncomfortable in some way to go and actually bring their concerns to the chief. So they felt that their perspectives didn't have a way to reach the decision maker. Police were mostly mentioned in a positive light, and that's both the community police and the RSIPF. There were some comments actually across both of them about weak or inconsistent enforcement of laws, issuing warnings instead of arrests, and also just difficulty in enforcing anything given pushback from families to protect people. Okay, lessons learned. Next slide. Again, I'm speaking as an implementing agency, so these are all necessarily rather concrete nuts and bolts takeaways. But first, from an implementation perspective, talking about mirroring the broader local turn in the field of peace building. As I've been saying over and over again, conflict prevention interventions, climate adaptation, they should be aligned to local priorities first, as a matter of course, as the right thing to do. and we could stop there. But we could go further and say they're also critical to the success of an intervention, any intervention, but maybe particularly for conflict prevention, considering conflict is as old as humanity. Societies have evolved incredible, powerful, meaningful systems for resolving them that have weight with people. Well, why wouldn't you use that if you wanted to have an effective solution? And in particular, just in terms of detail, local detail, the causal linkage or the exacerbating linkage between climate and conflict is so complex and so place-specific. We need place-specific information that allows us to unpack how is it working in this particular location, and hence how can we intervene if we want to prevent the conflict from emerging. We need essentially more of this kind of information from more locations to start to unpack what does climate security look like in the Indo-Pacific at the local level, and how can we come to grips with it. Second, as we've seen in these examples, the climate-linked conflicts are inextricably linked with other dimensions of climate risk: water, food, sea level rise, etc. Peace and conflict don't exist in a vacuum. We have to deal with the consequences of climate change in a conflict-sensitive, peace-positive way. And I mean, I would say that is a necessity. Climate action in our region going forward needs to, at minimum, take a conflict-sensitive approach. We, implementers, donors, no longer have the luxury of implementing conflict-bind interventions and expecting everything to go well. It's a question of effectiveness, but more importantly, a question of do no harm. And the time for conflict sensitivity, especially building capacity in conflict sensitivity, which is not super broad-based yet in this region, is now, before we are dealing with multiple active conflicts in the region and trying to implement around them. But going beyond do no harm, as I was saying, this intertangling of climate and conflict risks is why prevention of climate-linked conflict is far more effective. Again, this is based on the Africa and Middle East experience, and I believe pointed to by these results as well. It's far more effective to prevent conflict mainstreamed into a broader climate intervention rather than as some kind of standalone peace-building project. And by mainstreamed, I mean integrated as an outcome, a measurable outcome, not sort of vibes in the investment description, but a real outcome of the project that we're held to. Overall, what I'm calling for here is a kind of demystification or normalization of conflict prevention as an area of work, particularly within climate adaptation. If we know that climate change will probably bring an increased risk of violent conflict, including to our region, then climate change adaptation needs to include supporting communities with their capacity to peacefully manage these conflicts. It's just another element of climate adaptation, like dealing with increased waterborne diseases or dealing with increased disasters. Conflict prevention is just another dimension of climate adaptation, essentially. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you for really localizing the experience of climate security here. And I think that's sort of one of the key understandings is I'm sure many people in the audience are city dwellers. And sort of the importance of security, the importance of place and place-based identities and their relationship to spirituality, but also to food security and so on, is something that to city dwellers in the West, I think, is quite alien. More so than just localizing climate security, also Christine made it very clear that gender plays a key role. That's sort of really, we're looking at multi-scalar notions of climate security. The ones that we hear about are mostly about national security, the military, and so on. But really what Christine's data here really shows is that it starts at the body, goes to the community, and sort of the multi-scalar issues that come from climate security. I think also what you showed really well is how climate change is a threat multiplier, that land has always been an issue of conflict, I mean, across the world, but certainly the centrality and importance of land in the Pacific and therefore the centrality in conflict systems, is we can really see how climate change in many different ways, through climate adaptation projects, through REDD+, but also just through changing land and water dynamics, feed into these conflicts. So a really good way of situating some of these issues. And then another part, and I think that is I think the question always has to be, what can we learn from different contexts, right? We're not trying to solve people's problems, but we try to learn from each other, ideally. That could be sort of a new way of thinking about aid. And I think what was really clear in the Solomons and across the region is the biggest finding in disaster risk reduction is the best thing you can do is to build social networks, right? The way that you bounce back, resilience, really, the forefront of resilience is social networks, is getting to know your neighbors. And so local systems like the One Talk system also, as problematic they might be from a gender perspective, or so on and so on, they also give us a really good example of how climate resilience actually work on a local level. And we have a lot to learn from that, I think. So thank you, Christine. That was really excellent. What we want to do for the next sort of maybe 20 minutes, and then we open it up for general questions, is a couple of panel questions. That is to all the panelists, whoever wants to be a taker. And my first question really is, and that links to what Christine said, the alphabet soup, right? We have these new concepts, new paradigms that we form policy on, and we then forget old ones and repackage old ones. But really, what is the added value of the term climate security in the Pacific and beyond? And what is lost if we drop the term? So that's to our panelists. What is the added value of the term and concept of climate security in the Pacific and beyond? And what is lost if we would just drop the term?
Well, my quick answer to this, because I did speak about it in the presentation, is at the very least we should be talking about climate peace and security, because peace allows us to take a longer term view, to look at the problem over a longer frame of time, and also to look at the structural causes about why we're in the crisis we're in. And I think peace also has the added value of looking at the problem from multiple lenses. If you only look at sea level rise as a problem without the fact that population is increasing, mangrove depletion is leading to increased effects of king tides and so forth. So we need to look at the problem more holistically than just very sort of linear descriptions of climate change security as a threat. So at the very least, let's talk about climate peace and security. And in the broader terms, we have in the Pacific, and I feel very bereft this morning because Paulo is not with us, because he would talk about Pacific traditions of peace building and why he uses the term peace and security often to encompass some of these broader frames for the problem. So yeah, Paulo, I wish you were here to elucidate on this more, but I think that him and others would make the argument for peace and security as a better frame that can allow us to address some of the longer term problems and the interlinked nature of the problem that we're in.
Yeah, thank you. I just I want to add a point from the discussions that we have in South Asia, is that the one problem with saying climate security is that there is a tendency then to think about it from a very narrow climate lens. So in that sense, climate security equals to greenhouse gas emissions equals to renewable energy. And that's it. That's the end of it's a very linear discussion. But it's more than that, right? It needs to be more than that. So for me, I would say, it's we don't drop it, but we enhance it in that sense, right? So either climate peace and security, but I would also say climate and security, where the framing of what security is broader. So it's human and environment security, and climate is not just weather patterns and greenhouse gas emissions and renewable energy, but it's food and it's water and it's livelihood. So in that sense, I would say we need I don't know, I don't have a catchy title of how we encompass all of these things into a phrase, but that's that value of what that looks like really needs to change.
Just one final point, which I forgot to raise in the presentation, which is also really important, is sometimes when we talk about climate change and we talk about solutions, we go to technological solutions, for example, solar power. But one of the big criticisms I have of some of the solar power projects in the Pacific is that they supply the solar power panels without any conception of what will happen to the waste when those solar panels break, don't work, how can we create more circular economies within the islands? Because if you've ever traveled to Kiribati or one of our smaller atoll countries in the Pacific, you will know that the space to accommodate waste is not there. The technological equipment to deal with waste is not there. So thinking about climate in a sort of way where we're also thinking about reducing consumption and having more of a circular economy to deal with waste. Waste is a huge problem in our Pacific Islands region and often one that gets forgotten in this sort of discussion. But it illustrates the need to think about it more broadly, to think about actually our islands, how do they survive, and how do we do that in ways that address climate but also environmental issues.
Christine, do you want to? Otherwise, I think what both of you point to very eloquently is the complexity of it, and we often invent these new terms in order to show something new, right? The relationship between security and climate change, but then get bogged down in them and forget what both of you have just pointed out. What do these terms obscure? And I guess what's really important with climate change, similar to gender, is that we understand that it is something that makes our world more complex, that it's a sort of total social fact that exists in everything, and that we really need to approach climate security with a complexity lens that looks at all of these other aspects, food security, of course, but also waste and these different connections. So I really appreciate that we can't get bogged down in these definitions, but have to think about them very, very broadly. So thank you for that. My next question would be, what would a climate secure community look like in the Pacific? Like a given Tuesday afternoon, you walk into a community, what do you think makes a community climate secure? And, because no climate security community exists really. So conjecture is fine. What does a climate secure community look like?
I'll have a go. The first thing that came to mind when you said that was something about, I guess, that it's not a static picture of a community that is sort of behind a wall and preserved from these factors and untouched by them, but one that is in a kind of dynamic equilibrium where, as things change, and things are going to change, that the vital capacity, I guess, within the community, the institutions, the people, the knowledge, the practices, they change as well to keep up with and supersede these changes. So it's security in motion. I don't know.
I really think we should return to talking about rights in this discussion. And we have a lot of good examples here in Australia of Indigenous management and rights over natural resources, such as river systems. So we need to think about security is not something that can be provided for you, but it can be achieved through realization of Indigenous people's rights over their lands, their oceans, their aquatic resources. And rights to not only manage those resources for themselves, but to protect them from threats that are coming through climate change and others. Now, climate change too, I think it's a global responsibility, and the Pacific has been particularly vocal and effective in advocating for climate action, on the international level. So at the COP meetings, through the International Court of Justice, recent decision on climate change, and others. So that is another, again, example of basically Pacific people enacting their rights more on an international scale. So a lot of the issues that we face that are environmental issues are related to rights, education, and the ability to see the problems. So, for example, I have some colleagues in Solomon Islands, and they've done research on mangroves, and one of the things that emerged from that is looking at traditional knowledge of mangroves is that the challenges they're facing, because they have oral history over time to understand what's happened to their mangroves, the challenges that they're facing in what's happening to mangroves right now is new and it's unprecedented. So sometimes that's where the science, the education comes in to kind of, help communities deal with these new problems that they have. But I really do think we need to think more scalar, not just from community level, island level, because you can't do work in one community in the islands and then, you have other threats in other parts of that same island. It's an interrelated ecosystem. So thinking more on multiple scales and thinking more about how we enable informed consent, rights, and sustainable management together as a package.
Thank you. And in a way, my probably last question before we open it up for questions now is Ambika, you certainly are an expert in this in certain ways, but when we talk about climate security in the Pacific, from the vantage point of Australia, we always have this elephant in the room, right, which is China. So if my question would be, what are the geopolitics of climate security in the Pacific? And can we speak to them, what they mean for local realities, right? And outside of an aid conference, that's often what we read about. So can we make this connection? So what are the geopolitics of climate security and how do they connect to the local level? Would be my last question to the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Siad. I am no expert at all. But I have to say, it only took us, 1 hour and 15 minutes to mention China, which is quite long, actually. In most settings, it would have been like 3 minutes. I feel like I'm not an Australian or a Pacific Islander, so I have no business commenting on the behalf of either this country or the region. But maybe as someone who's seen what happens when we don't understand geopolitical movements and machinations, we saw that in Sri Lanka a few years ago, for example, and the effects of that. And unfortunately, with the present cyclone, we're seeing just how much Sri Lanka is struggling. They were getting back on their feet, and now they've been pushed back, several steps. With the devastation that's happened in the last few days with the cyclone there. When I was in the Solomon, we had some very interesting discussions with folks at the university, but also I visited some of the smaller islands from Gizo. We went to some of the smaller islands, and I saw all of these different projects. And the one thing that keeps coming up is China, right? China is a big partner over there. I saw the big hospital that they're going to be building, if they've started building. It's right next to the there's a new ministry building that the Indians are funding, and both of these buildings come after this big billboard that says AAC $5 billion. And I'm like, this is a very interesting picture. And I think it's very indicative of what the geopolitics of this region looks like. I mean, I would say two things, I guess. One is that you can't will away and ignore China. They are there. They are filling in a lot of the gaps that have been left behind by other partners. They are doing it faster. They are smarter in that sense. And for a country that needs, a hospital or whatever it is that they need, unless you're willing to step in and say, okay, I will do what you need, let's partner together, so you don't partner with somebody I don't trust. If you're not willing to step in and step up, then you cannot say don't have a hospital. Right? I think that's I mean, that's a ridiculous position to be in. I can understand to some extent the fears of countries in this region that think about things like, interference, disinformation campaigns, what technological manipulation could look like in the future. There is a lot of information about China's involvement in the drug trade, for example, increasing use of fishing equipment for movement of things that are not fish, but also increase fishing and stuff like that. So how do we understand what is happening at that level to ensure then that our work at that partnership level is strengthened and is smarter? And I would say one thing in that sense to what I was trying to say earlier is that community, local level, bottom-up partnerships are the best form of resilience, both for your climate, for your long-term security enhanced, and also as a mitigation for geopolitical events, right? It has to be at that level. Until countries, whether it is Australia or others around the world, till countries get that, they are not going to be able to move beyond anything, fallout of any kind of geopolitical movements. Siad, I don't know if that answered your question, but
that was great. No, that was great. Anyone else in the panel? Otherwise, we can open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you very much for answering those questions. So we open it up for the audience. I don't think I can moderate that because I can't hear everyone in the audience. So if somebody could locally moderate the Q&A with the audience, please.
Hey, Tobias Ide, Murdoch University and Accept. I have a question, perhaps specifically for Christine, but the other presenters feel free, happy to talk to it. I really like the model you presented at the local level, but if we think about supporting it, formalizing it at a more national level, even at an international level, we often face these silos. There's the climate environment silo, there's the peace and conflict silo, the foreign policy silo, the development silo. How do we work across the silos on a more institutional level to drive these initiatives forward?
The silos are something that I deal with a lot, even within my own organization. We have, environment teams, fragility teams, food security teams, et cetera. And I feel like most of what I do is banging heads together. I think that the breakdown of these silos will come not through a tool, but through one, an increasing obviousness of the situation, and two, through relationships. Is that too cheesy to say? But that's how I've seen it in my own organization. The tools come second. It is about people knowing what other people are working on and seeing it reflected in their own work. Maybe particularly in this area, there's a blind spot problem where whichever side you're coming from, you normalize the other half of it until you don't anymore. So, yeah, I'd start with that before than with institutionalizing a particular tool, as wonderful a tool as this is, though.
Yeah, I think the silos, the funny thing for me about the silos is if you go to a community, they experience, China-Australia or China-West geopolitical conflict, climate change, other environmental changes, land conflicts, and often other issues as well, gender-based violence, etc., as connected and as one, reality that they're living in. So it's only us, in academia and in the development sector that have these siloed boxes. How do we get beyond it? Well, we need to actually look back from the community perspective. How are all these things experienced together? And, I've been around the development sector for a long time, and my frustration, of course, with it constantly is that you have a really good project about something. Let's say it's water and sanitation. But you don't link up water and sanitation to gender-based violence issues or to other issues, right? So you have something really good that happens, but building on it, scaling it, actually interconnecting it to something else that can really lead to change on the community level, and then on the island level, province level, national level. And there are ways to do it. I don't think we need to look very far to find good models of it. For example, gender-based violence, the services in Solomon Islands are much more connected to the police, connected to other parts of the problem health sector, and etc. So that multi-sectoral approach to service provision is there. We don't have such a good track record of doing that multi-sectoral approach to environmental and climate issues, and maybe that's something to think about. How do we interconnect this stuff? Because the problem is experienced as all of this stuff coming at you all the time, together on the same day, in the same hour, right? We need to move to, okay, how do we come at the solution in a similar way?
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, to Siad, for the valuable insights. I'm Pallavi. I work at the Australian High Commission, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Delhi. Ambika and we've engaged briefly on gender in foreign policy. My question is basically very fundamental and related to the project that I manage. We, in the panel and across presentations, the key point that came out was community ownership, accountability, and the relationship with environment on climate resilient models. So what I've seen in my region and the country is that if there are sustainable business models, how can those sustainable business models be economically viable? Now, the question on China also, that if there are, products that are easily and cheap, it's less expensive is available compared to products which are built in a sustainable way, but are expensive and are not taken by the market. Then how do we ensure that the communities who are reliant on nature, on environment-based solutions, have an economic model that works for them? I know that partner governments, it's more structural question at a policy level, but I'm interested to know that as a donor organization, what interventions we can bring in. Thank you.
I heard interventions. I love this question. Thank you. I think particularly, again, answering from an implementer perspective and thinking about similar work and kinds of things that we've done in this area, which is relating to market systems development approaches. So fostering the development of new businesses, small businesses, sometimes with a particular bent, whether nutrition or sanitation or climate adaptation in this case. So I think there's a real possibility here to help this new wave of, let's call them climate adaptation businesses, get over the hump and get started, particularly small businesses, which are going to be the most critical for meeting a lot of needs for the poorest of the poor, is through what we already know about market systems development, through business coaching, et cetera. But I think there's an interesting possibility for some blended finance approaches as well, maybe for slightly more mature businesses, one size up, who are looking to scale and get a bit bigger and support the needs of more and more people, but a locally grown business, so to speak. This is work that I know some of the climate vertical funds fund at quite large scale for rather large businesses looking to go global. But I think there's not as many instances of consistent investment, something like an investment in a blended finance fund for small and growing, supporting small and growing climate adaptation businesses from a market perspective, so supporting demand and consumer awareness as well. Something like that is what I would think of.
Can I? Yeah. Thank you. That's a really good question. I would say, one, what is sustainable for you might not be sustainable for me. And I think it's important to understand where that intervention is meant to be, where you want to work, and understanding what it is that they need. Right? In some ways, it might not fit a donor's idea of what sustainability looks like. Now, of course, a more sustainable, secure world is good for everyone, but the steps to get there, I think we need to be a little bit more cognizant of what it is that village or island or whatever community might need. And to add on to what Christine was saying, it's about where we want to put our funding in some ways. And I'll give a very specific example. There's a village in Western India in the state of Maharashtra where we had done some research some years ago, me and some folks from my team, we'd done some research on looking at the water projects in this village. They have really cool mangroves, and in these mangroves, they have a very specific species of otters. So I had actually gone to see the otters over there, and the one big business model over there that the women of that village wanted to enhance was do otter tourism as a way for empowerment for themselves, but also then to use that money to save the mangroves. And a lot of the donors that were coming to that village all wanted to set up schools for girls. Now, schools for girls is not a bad thing, but the women in that village wanted money to buy nice boats, to be able to do otter tourism, to help themselves and help the mangroves, and so help their families, which would then ultimately trickle down. So that is what they wanted the money for first. Not to say that they didn't want it for the schools for girls, but that was a next step. This is how the pathway that they thought was important. Now, they did eventually get that money for those boats, and they have some of the best otter tourism plans, experiences, and if you're ever in India, I would urge you to do that. If mangrove tourism and otters is your thing, it's fantastic the way they have organized this whole system. And then they use that money to save the mangroves. It is one village that whenever Western Maharashtra gets inundated by extremely heavy monsoons, that village is actually quite safe because of that mangrove restoration and prevention systems over there. And now they are building a creche and a school and moving on. So what is that question of what is the need and what does sustainability look like? I think we need to ask those very hard questions. And I would say to donors, fund more research, because you don't have time to answer all these questions, but the researchers, they have the time.
Thank you. I'm not sure if everyone can. We're actually at the hour, I think. We're at our time, 1:45. And so if you want to have a conversation afterwards, you absolutely should. But I want to thank everyone who's come to see the panel. But above all, I want to thank our panelists for reminding us what climate security is and what it isn't, right? Ask yourself what it can help us to show, what it obscures. Think about the complexity and interconnectedness it shows. Think about the rights-based and local approaches, and always remember that people have the answers quite often, but also facilitate and think about the governance and so on, and really think about new ways of working together with this framework. So thank you. We're all thinking about Paulo. I hope you're better. And thank you, everyone, for being here today.